Hey guys! Well, in today's chapter, Sarah is going to spill the beans about some things in her life that she has kept secret up until this point. Of course, it's now all out in the open, but nonetheless, very interesting to hear what those secrets are and to hear why she kept them a secret. She's also going to open the door and shed some light on an area of her life she has not talked about up until this point. It hasn't been mentioned in the story, and it was a very big deal to her and her family. So we're eventually going to get to that, but today she starts to set that up a little bit. Without giving anything away, let's just get right into today's chapter. Chapter 22. During those early years in Centerville, we had to make our own fun and entertainment. There were no dance halls or amusement halls, nothing. We women especially were left alone a good part of the time while our husbands were away working to earn a living. We did our own gardening if we had one, everything, inside and out, most of us. I had lots of good friends, but never another one so close as Mary. We found much we could do together, and it was more pleasant for both that way. I myself did nursing when I could be spared from home, and this helped to get us by. I got very little money, but mostly food stuff, wheat, corn, wool for spinning and knitting, and the like. It all helped in a big family like ours. When Sister Duncan couldn't come for a confinement, either because she was on another case or was ill, we were blessed to have a very dear lady living in Centerville whom we called Grandmother Brown. She too was an excellent midwife, and as the town grew, she was kept busy nursing the sick and helping to lay out the dead. There was no doctor closer than Salt Lake for so many years. I should tell you that Sister Duncan was often called to Farmington and even to Kaysville, as well as Bountiful. We had lots of quilting bees. When one of us would get a quilt pieced and the blocks sewn together, we'd all get together and mark the quilt and quilt the whole thing in one day. The hostess, or one whose quilt it was, would cook a nice dinner, usually quite plain, for food was scarce. We'd go first thing in the morning and stay till the quilt was done. Sometimes one of the others might bring the dessert, another the salad, and we'd have a real feast. We'd sit around the quilt and work like beavers, seeing who could get the most tiny stitches onto her needle all at one time. 9 was the very most anyone could do. Usually it was 7, and that made for a lovely looking quilt. Thread, too, was hard to get and very expensive, so we were careful not to waste so much as an inch. Knots must be small and coaxed through the top layer of the quilt and hidden there so it would not show. We took great pride in our work then. It's hard to find such, even and fine perfect quilting now. It's hard to find such even and fine perfect quilting now. They're in too big of a hurry to get it done. As we worked, sometimes we'd sing old pioneer songs as Come, Come Ye Saints, Wait for the Wagon, and others. Someone would start and the rest would fall in. Other times we'd visit, tell stories. It was all such fun. Other times we'd get together when our husbands were away and read. That is, one would read and the others would do handwork. I remember Grandmother Brown subscribed for a magazine called The New York Ledger. It came once a month. It carried a novel in serial form, a chapter or so each month. And when it came, we'd have a party. Just the 4 of us, Mary, Millie, Grandmother Brown, and me. We'd watch for the mail that brought it, Pony Express. The one who could furnish the main dish, usually a chicken or even a roast, once in a great while, would hang out a white tablecloth on the clothesline early in the morning where the other 3 could see it from their homes. This meant, come to my house and bring whatever you can. I'll furnish the meat. Then at lunch, we'd go to that place and one of us would read aloud while the others knitted or sewed. and have a nice luncheon and spend a delightful afternoon together. Sometimes we'd play a game of cards if the mail was late, and we felt the need of getting together for a little diversion. It was all in fun, but our husbands, Mary's and mine especially, and Millie's. Mary and Millie were wives of the same man, and he was bishop for a while, then later president of the stake. Did not approve of any type of card playing, so we played only when they were out of town. But once, at my place, we almost got caught. We were deeply engrossed in our game when we suddenly heard my front door open. It was T. Whitaker, my husband. Well, I had my white apron on, and I simply leaned over the table and swept the whole deck, just being dealt, off the table and into my lap, and folded the apron over them, so when he entered from the front hallway, there we sat around the table, innocent as lambs. He never caught on, and I never told him. You see, Brigham did not approve of card playing in any form, and advised against having cards in the home. He said they carried an evil influence. Of course, T. Whitaker abided strictly by every word of the president, but I wasn't so straight-laced, and I saw no harm in an innocent little game of cards, played just for the fun of it. It happened only when we knew the men would all be away, and goodness knows, we needed something for a bit of relaxation and entertainment. I lived sort of in the center of the four of us. Millie was just across the street west, and Grandma Brown just north of Millie, and Mary south a block. Rarely, but only when she wasn't working, Sister Duncan would join us. She lived up east, but all four could see the white cloth and knew what it meant. Another time, when we got together to read the ledger, my husband again put in an unexpected appearance, and I had served my guests a nice hot cup of real tea. After they had gone, he noticed the used teacups and teapot. "Lizzie," he said, "you know you're breaking the word of wisdom every time you drink that stuff, and it's not good for you. You'd live a lot longer if you left that stuff alone." "Well," I answered, "I'd just as lieve live 10 minutes less and have something I enjoy once in a while." "Oh, Lizzie, my dear, I'm afraid you have some Gentile blood in those veins of yours." Yet he never forbid or denied me anything I really wanted, if it were possible. He was so good to me that I loved him in spite of myself, more than I realized, until quite suddenly everything changed. Like Job, I was compelled to say, "That which I most feared has come upon me." But before I explain further, I must tell you that he sent to England shortly after we moved into the big house, and had his sister send him some silkworm eggs. She sent them by mail in a large, thick envelope, and they arrived in perfect condition. And that's when we used the big bay window for them. He built a shelf above the seat, the full length of the window there in the living room. That's where we raised and cared for the silkworms. When they were fully grown and wove their cocoons, we had to watch them very carefully. Just before they were ready to bore out of the cocoons, we heated a large wash boiler with boiling water and dropped them into it. We saved only enough for eggs for the next set. The boiling water killed the worms and softened the tiny threads of silk, so that we could wind it off onto spindles and spin it into thread. T.W. made me a perfect, very fine loom for weaving the silk from fine copper wire. I made the first silk in Utah, and before I die, they want it to put among the relics they intend to put in a pioneer building someday. I made a silk vest and knitted a tie and a pair of silk socks for Brigham Young, and one set exactly like it for T.W. I loved that little room. It made perfect material, and Brigham complimented me on my beautiful weaving and knitting from silk, and said I'd go down in Utah history for it. The picture of T.W., which you all have a copy of, shows him wearing the vest and tie I knitted from the silk. I also made the suit he is wearing. In fact, every stitch of clothing he has on in that picture, I made. Wove the cloth and spun the wool and the cotton. Brigham Young was so overjoyed with the gift of silk socks, tie, and vest that he made a special trip out to Centerville to see for himself the whole setup, and insisted we should start up the first silk business in the West. But I wanted none of that. The worms were really a nuisance. We fed them on mulberry leaves. T.W. planted the trees and raised them especially for that purpose, cleaned and carded and dyed it. Then I spun it into yarn fine enough to weave into cloth and made the suit. I made all the woolen stockings for the family, knitted them by hand. My friend Mary loved to knit. She would knit constantly when we were together, unless we were quilting. When we read from the New York Ledger, one would read and the others would do handwork. Knitting, tatting, mending, none was idle. I was happy, content, and felt the real joy of living. I had many friends and no enemies. Annie was a good help and had a sweet, pleasant disposition, very pleasant to have around. She was just like one of the family. It was she who tended the children when we met at my place to quilt or sew. It's interesting, at the bottom right here is our first picture in the book. Right here, it's a baptism certificate for Thomas Whitaker when he was a baby from a parish near where he was born. Interesting that that's where she placed it in the book, was at the end of this chapter. So anyways, that is it for today's reading. She kind of leaves us on a cliffhanger because she talks about how she relates to Job and how things are about to go terribly wrong and her worst fear is about to come to pass. And then the chapter ends. So, going forward in these next chapters, we are going to hear more about that. This is where her story cut off, and so we only hear about it through her interview. So stay tuned for that, and I would love to hear your thoughts about those little secrets that she revealed, things that she kept from her husband and that she and her friends kept from all of their husbands, going against the word of wisdom, not following the counsel of a prophet, and then hiding that. So it's interesting. This is something she so openly admits at this late age in her life after her husband has already passed away. She kind of comes clean with that, but she seems to be a little bit proud of it. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that. It is interesting reading shorter biographies and stories of some of my other pioneer ancestors because they were very stalwart. They had very strong testimonies of the word of wisdom, of following the counsel of the prophet, and just like Sarah Elizabeth, sacrificed so much because of their testimony. So it is interesting to see some ancestors who were very stalwart that way, and then other ancestors who later in life sort of cherry pick what they want to follow and what they don't. And it's interesting to me knowing that they hide it. They sort of have this underground club where they do these things. And I don't know. In my marriage, I will say I would never feel good about hiding something from my husband. We are very open with each other, and I can't imagine having to be nervous or scared, knowing he might walk through the door at any time, catching me doing something that goes against our beliefs. So that's a little different. Have you found things like that as well as you have read biographies from your ancestors? I would love to hear. But yes, Sarah, whom we call Elizabeth, was very proud of her silkworms and her spinning wheel. I have more to share about that in the documentary, so I can't wait to finally get that out. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you next week for chapter 23.